Thank you very much. There was a period when I was using the internet and knew every single person on a first-name basis who was on the net. And that was in 1969, 1970, in the very early days. And many of the people who were early users and part of the community that brought you digital convergence truly had no idea that it was going to explode to the degree that it has. But some of us really did believe that things like flat panel displays, like sort of the multimedia as we know it today, were definitely going to happen even if we had the scale and the timing wrong. So the question today is, what's happening today that was similar to 1970 that will be happening tomorrow? What are some of the things now? Because we can project very easily things about bandwidth and so on, but what are some of the big changes? And I'm going to try and address that by going back to some very basic phenomena. Just over 50 years ago, the world was basically composed of two elements: things, physical things, and ideas. And what happened in the 1950s and 60s was that the bit emerged. This little 1 and 0, the world of digital, emerged about that time. Most people don't realize that the word bit did not even exist until 1949. And what happened with bits is that a third element, it's not really physical, in fact, it's certainly not physical, but it also represents things, it represents ideas. You can manufacture them, ship them, deliver them. And so the world of what I would call bits and atoms emerged that created convergence. It created the ability to take things that were separate previously and make them one, and did some enormous disruption. Disruption, for instance, in intellectual property, a huge disruption. In fact, notice in English the word property is even in the expression intellectual property. And suddenly, ideas, music, any kind of artistic expression could be distributed and remanufactured, and the original and the copy were identical. So these big changes happened through that convergence. Now the question is, what's the next convergence? And the next convergence is quite simply where the bits and atoms aren't different, but they come back together. And this is something that's perhaps hard for us to understand because we think of them as so different today. Whereas tomorrow, you will be eating them, you'll be wearing them, and the digital world will be every part of your life, not in terms of boxes, not in terms of little handheld devices that we have in our pockets, but in terms of every physical thing you touch, everything you eat, everything that is around you. Every surface will be a display, potentially, and it may or may not turn on. Everything in our lives will have both a physical and computing element to it, and they will all talk to each other so that everything talks to every other thing. And networks might be so small that they're inside the elements of a drug that you take, like a vitamin pill. We will all be eating computers on a very regular basis. Or the network could be a big one, a whole neighborhood, networks, and from the bottom up as well as from the top down will be the future of telecommunications. And since I have so little time, I just want to end and then go into our Q&A with one remark about computing and devices in general. We will hear things this morning about the market, about new products and new devices. But one thing that's happening in the world today that is a sad turn of events, and it's sad for me because I've spent my entire adult life trying to make computers easier to use, and yet today they aren't easier to use. They are in fact more complex, more difficult, and in fact more frustrating than ever before. And in fact, even in some of the most marvelous devices that we receive today, which functionality that is beyond belief, when we receive them with books of information that are bigger than the device itself, more complex to read, and we all get very, very frustrated. And what's happening is that that's what's going to change in the short term. And we will go back to a simplicity of use that will come from a lot of embedded intelligence. And I would like to sort of urge people, when they think about convergence, that you don't just think about it in terms of telecommunications and computing coming together, but you think about a convergence of intelligence that includes not just the functions of the device, but eventually an element of common sense that it has and makes itself easier to use. So with that, I'll switch back to you, because I think you're going to ask some provocative questions.
네. 먼저 네그로폰테 교수님께 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. 네. Thank you, Professor. That was very informative. 자, 윤 박사님, 이 네그로폰테 교수님은 MIT에서 윤 박사님 스승이셨죠?
예, 그렇습니다.
네.
그러면은 그 이해를 돕기 위해서 몇
네.
가지 그 질문을 드리도록 하겠습니다.
네.
예, good morning, Nicholas. Thanks for coming. And I'm going to ask you a couple of questions today.
Okay.
So first question is about digital ethics. That and Korea has a reputation, or known as a laboratory for new digital technology, and I think that this reputation can be mainly contributed to the Korean consumers who are very proactive at taking or trying out new technology. And but I think it also has some downsides to that. So given this, what do you want to emphasize as the digital ethics or virtues that these digital citizens should keep in mind?
Well, I'm not a great expert on the downside, because I tend to be a very optimistic person, and I think what Digital Korea has done is make Korea a much more innovative society. And in fact, one can argue that economic development has to happen before a nation can be creative. And that if you look at nations that are in a stage of development, all of the elements of development come from discipline, come from teamwork, come from all of the things that are very different than what makes a creative society. And a creative society has a lot of conflict and contradiction. So some people may, in fact, look at that as a negative and look at that as some unethical and say our young people are undisciplined, they're misbehaving, they're doing things that we never did. And yet that is the beginning of a very rich and creative society, which is where the whole world is going.
Yeah. And the second question is about the disruption that you mentioned in your speech as well. And you talked about several disruptions that we've observed over the last a decade. And you recently talked about the virtual being physical and etc. other disruptions. And what do you think that these continuities are led by? Is it mainly coming from technology disruption or technology advancement, or it could be led by consumer behaviors or social changes as well?
Well, a disruption is always started by a technology that allows you to do it. And then there are very often forces, which could include industrial interests and regulatory forces, that will keep it down for a while. But if you look at today, just something as simple as voice over IP, that's very disruptive to our traditional models. It works fine, and there is an economic model that will work for it. And when I hear people say that, for instance, Wi-Fi doesn't have an economic model, what they're really saying, it doesn't have their economic model. It has a different one. It's a device industry. The costs are distributed in different ways. But if you look at the use on a per capita basis, the expense is very high. It's just a different economic model. So the disruption is a disruption of the older economic models falling aside because a newer one takes the place.
Thanks for your answer. I guess we have another occasion to discuss more about this interesting topic.
네, 고맙습니다. 네그로폰테 교수님, 윤 박사님 잘 들었습니다. 고맙습니다.